Hi everyone, so my name's Jacob. I'm currently a postdoc at Imperial College London, working on the Bridging the Gap project, which we heard a bit about earlier in collaboration with Francisco and Alex and James at QUB. Actually today I'm going to talk a bit about my PhD research. I'm going to be talking about a few things from like 2015, 2016, so I'm really digging deep to remember some of this stuff, but I think it's all relevant stuff, and hopefully some of you guys will find it interesting and useful. So yeah, I'm talking about accessible plucked string instruments, which was the topic of my PhD, looking at ways to develop instruments, guitar-like instruments essentially. I'm a guitarist and a bassist, so those were the instruments that I was interested in, that kind of meet the access needs of various disabled musicians. So I'm going to talk about just one very specific part of my PhD research, because obviously I don't have time to go over the whole thing, about the role of cultural forms. So Michael Horn talks about cultural forms. He describes them as social constructions or conventions that are linked to recurrent patterns of activity. And he gives a really nice example, kind of thought experiment of, you can imagine a playground with a bunch of children, and there's a rope in the playground, and you can imagine that the children are going to play with the rope. They might play tug of war, they might skip with it, they might invent some entirely new game with the rope. And then with the same group of children, there's a skipping rope, so it's the exact same rope, it just has a handle at either end, and what you would expect is that the children would actually skip with it. They might still play tug of war, but the likelihood is that they'll start skipping. So just by adding these handles, it hasn't changed the affordances of the rope, it hasn't added any extra functionality, but because there's this understood sort of cultural form of skipping, that's what people are led to do with the rope. So it's a really interesting kind of way of looking at using visual cues in design to sort of guide people towards understanding and interacting with a device in a particular way. So obviously I'm very interested in the cultural form of guitar playing. So to kind of understand a bit more about what I mean about the cultural form of guitar playing and what makes a guitar performance, I'm going to play 4 short videos, and just ask you to kind of think about which of these videos is more or less... Well, she's walking! I'll just start that again. So which of these videos is more or less a guitar-like performance? Okay, so we heard a bit of that already. Well, she's walking through the clouds with a circus mind. Just forgot to plug it in. Okay, I don't know what keeps skipping on the slide. And then the last one. Okay, so those examples, some of them are a bit silly, but they're all clearly very talented performances, and they're all kind of in some way more or less guitar-like. Some of them you could watch without sound and understand that it's a guitar video, and others you could listen to it without watching and believe that you were hearing a guitar performance. So there's something about guitar playing that isn't just holding a guitar and playing a guitar. There's this sort of understanding of what makes a guitar a guitar. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a bit about some of the studies that I did as part of my PhD. The first one was the Adapted Bass Guitar Study, which was a collaboration with the OMI Trust. And the goal here was to design a method of playing the bass guitar without the use of one hand and arm, which is the kind of parameters for the OMI Trust instrument building competition. I won't go into too much detail about how we designed it and why we designed it the way that we did, but basically what we came up with was a sort of mechanism that attached to a sort of off-the-shelf bass guitar that would mechanically fret the strings, and then sorry, there's a ghost operating my laptop that keeps skipping without me touching it. And then a MIDI controller that kind of controls this mechanism, and I'll just give a quick demo of what that sounds like. As you can tell, it's not a finished instrument, and actually I didn't get much further with developing the bass than that, pretty much because actually adding a whole bunch of incredibly heavy solenoid actuators to a bass is a terrible idea. It was really fun to make and an interesting project, but I can't imagine anybody actually choosing to play this instrument, especially it was already very heavy and we only managed to get 6 notes attached to it. So. But it was a really interesting kind of jumping off point to think about accessible plucked string design. We thought, sort of thinking about the bass, like what worked about it and what didn't. Why was it sort of so important that there were these real, tangible acoustic strings that you could interact with and get haptic feedback and a real acoustic response? If you shut your eyes and listen to that, you could imagine that there was a fairly ropey bass player playing an unadapted bass, so we actually hadn't adulterated the sound at all. But also the importance of the fact that it was a bass, it looked like a bass, even though we'd reduced so much functionality, you would look at it and say that's a bass guitar. So what was the significance of A, the fact it looked like a bass, and B, the fact that you could interact with real strings and get an acoustic response? So to dig further into that, I, along with a co-researcher at Queen Mary, designed a kind of comparative study with, I don't know why I keep saying that, with a bunch of different instruments that are sort of more or less guitar-like, kind of mixing and matching sort of the visual cues of a guitar with the sort of interaction modality. So a guitar shape versus a tabletop instrument, and strings versus a touch sensor. And another thing we questioned was, does prior experience with the guitar matter? This is a really whistle-stop tour of this study, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'll play a quick video to show you what those instruments look and sound like. The results from that study were that it's very complicated. It kind of matters to some people more or less whether it looks like a guitar or doesn't, and it matters to other people more or less whether it has strings or it doesn't. Very generally speaking, the non-musicians preferred the guitar form regardless of whether it has strings or not, and some guitarists preferred the presence of strings regardless of whether it was shaped like a guitar. But what really came out of it is that both are important, and it's very much contextual, based on people's prior experience. So the next study that we did with the Strummi was a move away from our kind of lab-based studies. We actually did that previous study with non-disabled participants, just to get a general sense of the interaction between guitar shape and interaction modality, but obviously it's much more important to see how these things are used and perceived and operate in the wild. So we worked with a group of learning disabled musicians with various access needs to sort of look at whether the Strummi was capable of meeting their access needs, of supporting their musical goals, and importantly, how do people compare the Strummi to other kind of traditional instruments. So I'll gloss over a few things, but basically what we sort of observed from looking at the way that people used the instrument in these kind of real world music making sessions. So some really interesting unexpected ways of playing, like these two they actually hadn't met before this session, but they both clocked that they had a similar impairment to their right hand, and realised that if they both played the same instrument at the same time, then they could kind of play together using their sort of unaffected hands. And the woman on the right also felt that she could use the Strummi as a support for her hand exercises that she had to do every day to sort of keep her wrist moving, which is not what the Strummi was designed for, but it was interesting that that's what she saw with it. There's a bunch of other really, really interesting stuff that happened during these sessions that I'm not going to have time to go into, so I'm going to skip that. And just the last couple of points. Well, I think we've already talked quite a lot about how context is really important. There's no such thing as an instrument which is inherently accessible or inaccessible. It's really about the way that it's used, the environment around its use, the people that support people to use those instruments in ways that are sort of comfortable and interesting to them. And finally, I just wanted to quickly talk about the sort of affirmation and integration view of disability arts and how cultural forms kind of play into that. So within disability arts, there's kind of not opposing, kind of complementary ways of viewing sort of disability arts. There's this kind of affirmation stance where you produce art and you perform in a way that very much affirms and explicitly deals with the lived experience of disability. But there's also a kind of integrative approach, which is more to do with disabled people playing music or performing any kind of art form on an equal footing with non-disabled people as equals without any specific reference to disability. And this is something that I thought about a lot, when to sort of evoke the cultural form of an existing instrument and when not to, when to move away from traditional instruments, and when it's actually really useful to kind of bring in things like the guitar, even in instruments that actually don't have that many functional similarities with the guitar. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Yes, there's about 2 minutes for questions.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Well,
a little bit
yeah,
of time.
that's fine.
Or if there's more you want to say, then please do.
No, I think I'm done.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk more later or answer some questions.
So are there any questions? Don't forget to say your name before asking the question if there are any questions.
Hi, yeah.
So what did you learn about so one theme was about whether or not if it looks or feels or plays like a guitar or an instrument, that you can take those sort of affordances onto a different design. Does that follow through, or is it not really as easy as...
I think it's, I mean, it almost feels like a cop-out to say it's like contextual, but it feels like, so one thing I noticed in these music sessions where we observed people using the Strummi alongside other instruments, so one of the instruments there was an electric guitar, completely unadapted. There was nothing special about it, but a lot of people preferred to play that guitar just strumming open strings. But because the environment that they were in was one that allowed that way of making music and sort of saw value in sort of very rhythmic but not very harmonic playing, it was really important. what seemed important to them was holding a guitar, strumming it, almost like doing the kind of rock star kind of moves, because that's fun and that's important and valuable. So that could have been with the Strummi, or it could have been with electric guitar or something completely different that sort of allows you to do that kind of rock star kind of performance.
I suppose what I'm kind of thinking is, at what point is there a threshold you reach where it's so detached from the original thing that you kind of should abandon trying to copy over those affordances? Or?
Yeah, possibly. So a lot of the people that we worked with at Heart and Soul, who were the charity that we worked with for this final study, completely rejected the little tabletop Strummi. They just thought it was weird looking, they didn't understand it, and just, I think one guy just said, oh, this is really boring. But we made this other version, I don't know if, oh, there we go, yeah. So we made these two versions that were actually much more guitar shaped, and you kind of saw people gravitating towards those because they're guitar shaped. So I do think this one on the left, in certain contexts, when you're trying to support guitar playing, maybe could move too far away from guitar playing. But also that's not for everyone, because there were lots of people that really liked it as well. So yeah, I like what Evie was saying earlier about can't say the word. Plurality versus sort of universal design. You can't really account for everybody having the same response.
Yeah, it's Pete from Drake Scotland. Yeah, I think it's happened a few times. The idea of kind of one size fits all approach is in general quite a lot of what we have, and it is that kind of one size fits one, often with accessible technology. And I think that, just to echo what you said, plurality is, you need all of them, because for some people you spend the whole time with the long guitar neck sliding off the knees and trying to sort of strap it with gaffer tape and all these things, whereas actually a small guitar that can fit onto somebody's sort of wheelchair table. But the thing that I love about the Strummi, I just had a good go at it, was that it when you play it, you get that natural kind of acoustic instrument feel and that haptic kind of response. But because there's tech involved as well, it can kind of meet you at the level you need to be met. And I think it's that sense of when you come across an instrument that you want to keep playing, and you can also, because you can scratch the strings and you can kind of bend them, you can find different extended techniques. It's like an instrument that has kind of somewhere to go.
Yeah.
And you can quite imagine somebody spending quite a long time learning how to play it. And there's quite a lot of tech feels more like toys. And it's kind of fun for an hour, and then you never desire to pick it up again. So I think there is something, you could imagine you getting quite a nice relationship with that tech. But I think, we found that because we quite often use open tuning guitars, and people love the fact that you can't really tell that it's an adapted guitar, because they are like just there sort of joining the normal.
Yeah.
And that's, those two things coexist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks. There's definitely a lot of value in guitariness.
So I think we're gonna have to wrap it up there.
Yeah.
But, thanks,
very
Jacob.
much.